Scott, welcome to the podcast. So great to have you on. Now, I'm going to describe you as farmer turned filmmaker that makes amazing mountain biking videos. Now, I would refer to it as North Shore riding, but I wanted to let you kind of introduce yourself and maybe fill in some of those blanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Eric. Thanks for reaching out. It's cool to be on this podcast. Yeah, I used to be a farmer, and I did that for a really long time. I was about 10 years in the business and was growing vegetables as the way of making a living. And it kind of got to the place where it just wasn't feeling like there was an exit strategy to that. I was using my body every day, working in the field, on my hands and knees, picking lettuce out of the ground, and kind of wasn't getting anywhere. So it was like there was time for a change, and I had always been holding a camera, always taking pictures ever since I was a little kid. And one day I was like, oh, there's like a video button on this camera. Maybe I should try this and see what that's all about. And as soon as I did it, it was like instant, like this is where I want to go. And then it was just kind of figuring out that path to go from being a farmer into doing that as my new profession.
Wow. Now, was it a rocky transition? Because it's a pretty hard career shift.
Yeah, it was a bit of a shift. Prior to farming, I used to be a web designer. So I did have like some of the technical stuff, and I went to school for multimedia back in, I don't know, I guess it was the early 2000s, and like the dot-com bubble and all that sort of stuff was happening. And I was learning how to use Premiere and some of these editing programs back in their earlier days. Making terrible student films that I probably have somewhere buried on a hard drive. But the transition itself was just like more of a gradual process. I was doing it on the side. I was doing it for free in a lot of cases, just trying to figure out how to use a camera to make films, because it's similar in a lot of ways to photography, but there's a whole bunch of other skills like audio and being able to manage all this media that's a lot bigger and that sort of thing that I had to kind of figure out. And so I was running it concurrently, just working the 9 to 5, sometimes more to 9 to 5 on the farm. And then in the evenings, making YouTube videos and making videos for like local businesses and stuff like that. And kind of gradually grew that to a place where it was like, oh, if I full send on this and, instead of spending 1/3 of my free time on it, spend 100% of my time, I theoretically could at least pay my bills and then see where it goes from there.
Sure, make it work. And now, as I kind of peruse through your YouTube channel, I think most, if not all, of your films are mountain biking. Is that a specific passion of yours, or how did that come to be?
I think that was like a lucky accident. When I used to mountain bike a lot when I was maybe in my mid 20s, and then mountain bike got stolen in Vancouver, and I kind of just moved on from it. When I started farming, I was so tired at the end of the day. I was like, I'm not interested in riding this bike up a mountain. So I sort of lost touch with it, but it was always something that I would watch videos when they'd come up and they'd pop up on my YouTube feed. And I understood the sport enough. And I always knew that outdoor related filmmaking was kind of where I wanted to be. I didn't know if that would be like land conservation stuff, or maybe it would be like farming related, or maybe it would be like you see these North Face videos of people doing these expeditions up Everest or something, which I had no experience doing that. So the likelihood that that would be where I ended up is probably pretty slim. But I had a connection through a friend that introduced me to a local professional mountain biker named Mark Matthews, who lives in the smaller town that I'm based in. And he was just in a place where he was transitioning from his previous filmer who had started to kind of price out budget-wise, and he needed somebody new to work with. And I had zero experience making mountain bike films, and so I was like, hey, let's just start doing stuff for fun, just for free, just like get to know each other. And I would go out and help him film YouTube videos for his channel. And we just built a bit of a friendship. And then eventually he was like, oh yeah, I've got some sponsor budget. You want to try to make a film? And then it just kind of grew from there. And most of the stuff that I've done has really been with this specific athlete. And there's been a couple other folks that I've worked with, but he's like my main guy that has like, here's budget from larger sponsors to actually do bigger projects, which is always fun.
That's really cool. And I like the dynamic that the two of you have. It seems like mostly on his channel, it kind of, you feature the full length video. And then on yours, you show kind of the behind the scenes work, which is really intimidating and awe inspiring. The level of detail and structure that goes into some of these shoots.
Yeah, and I think we've really kind of structured the way we make content somewhat intentionally. Like we both understand that with social media, there's a bit of like feeding the machine, feed the beast. You know, you just have to be making content on a consistent basis. And so whenever we're doing a project or he's maybe building a trail, he's usually documenting that process from his end and the trail building end of that. And he goes out and films with a GoPro a lot of times. But then there's days where he'll do like a testing of a new feature and it's some gigantic jump that I would never touch. He's flying 30 feet in the air or something like that. And so it's usually good to have somebody out there to be a first responder, essentially, if something goes sideways. But then we also use that as an opportunity to make like a slightly higher quality video for his channel, where I'll film with a nicer camera than a GoPro, capture some of that authentic moment of him hitting this thing. And then sometimes I can repurpose that footage for my own channel. Maybe that's sort of the agreement we set out, like, oh, let's make sure that I get a little bit of explanation of why I'm shooting it this way while I'm also getting content for you. So it's a real like collaborative effort of just trying to generate stuff that we can post out there in different capacities. And then often when we actually do like the sort of culmination of those projects, it'll be a budgeted piece where one of his sponsors technical difficulties. These things don't love my ears. So when we get to the place of doing a sponsored project, when there's budget behind that, I can usually bring somebody on that's a behind the scenes person, and they can actually be that third person point of view. I can focus on what I'm doing, and they can capture all those more authentic reactions of me, reactions with him. Sometimes I'll have a photographer. But there's just kind of different facets that we try to bring into both of our channels and kind of support one another's growth through that.
And so now in these more official budgeted projects, do you find that the sponsor is approaching you with an idea or a concept and then you're kind of filling in the vision, or how does that collaboration work?
It's a little bit of both. Like sometimes it'll be a really clear product, like Hydro Flask we've done a few things with, where they want to feature. We did one where it was about foraging and they want to feature a camping dish set essentially. And so it's trying to figure out a story that we can authentically use this product. I'm not super into like blatant product placement. I like it to feel somewhat organic, even if it is more of like an ad, so to speak. And so in those particular cases, there's a little bit of a structure, and then we'll figure out a basic concept for how we want to do that, and we'll pitch that to the brand. But fortunately, with a lot of Mark's sponsors, they're just really open, and we can come up with whatever we think is cool and creative and throw it at them with a approximate budget that we think it'll take to do it. And most of the time they've said yes. Maybe there's been some flexing of what they actually want that to be. But yeah, it feels really fortunate to have sponsors that just kind of trust the vision. And then if you do cool stuff and it does well, then that just keeps building that trust in that relationship.
It's interesting to hear you describe kind of the process and the interaction with some of these clients. I've talked to a few different kind of filmmakers, and I find they all exist on some sort of spectrum, if you will, where some are a bit more focused on, hey, I can make this like standalone thing on YouTube work with ad revenue or with affiliate marketing. And then on the other side, I'm really more maybe dominant on external sponsors, and then YouTube and sort of social media is used as an amplifying tool. Do you find that you exist somewhere on that spectrum, or is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I would say like most of what I bring in terms of like being a self-sufficient business owner is primarily through sponsored projects, whether that's bike projects. I do some work locally for some land conservation, land trust organizations where they're trying to purchase land and protect it essentially. And there's usually funding with those. So that's the majority of what what comes in and keeps me going. But the YouTube thing is just finally starting to feel like traction is developing there. And it's been a long journey on that. It's been 5 years, maybe even slightly longer than I've been doing the filmmaking thing, of making that grow. And I think that's the real goal down the line, is to have YouTube actually be what sustains me, what pays the baseline bills, and being able to make whatever project I want to make. So I don't have to necessarily have a client tell me like, oh, we want to feature this particular product, figure out an idea. Instead, it could be like a brand like MusicBed getting behind me and saying, make something cool and put our name on it. And like that kind of creative freedom that's what gets me stoked to kind of keep the YouTube thing growing, because it is a long game. There's no way around it. You just kind of have to stay committed to that platform. But I think a little bit of both is always going to be nice, because sometimes it's great to have somebody say, here's $30,000, go make something cool with that, versus YouTube, which is like some months is like $100, so it's not always financially making sense. But I don't know. I really like the community onto YouTube. I think of all the social medias, it's the one that I feel the most connection with the people that watch the content. And people will write meaningful stuff. People like you reaching out after watching some of my stuff and wanting to have conversations like this. And I think I didn't find that on Instagram so much, which was the primary other platform I was using.
I could definitely see that. Instagram is maybe more flashy or more, attractive from that aspect, but it seems like, YouTube is a better way to engage, I guess, is what I would say. Now, I've found personally, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, that and you kind of mentioned it may require a little bit of feeding the beast, that YouTube and all of the social medias require a constant input. Does that conflict with your strategy, your style of filmmaking?
It's hard to always keep it fed.
Okay.
And honestly, like I allow YouTube to slide. It's a part of my overall thing of what I want to be doing, but because it doesn't really generate enough consistent income, or it hasn't, it's starting to get to a place where it is starting to shift into that space, and I might start thinking about it a little bit differently. But I just can't prioritize it all the time. Sometimes it's like the last thing I want to do is turn a camera on. It's just like I've been shooting all week, I've been editing all week, like, okay, now I have to come up with something creative to say and to do on YouTube. And the motivation isn't always there, because it's just you that you're accountable to for the most part.
I hear you on that one, but like your YouTube quality is so high. Actually, what I saw initially, kind of your work, was the 2022, or it looks like you put out kind of an annual Reels footage, that is amazing, and it was actually of such a high level that I was too intimidated to contact you, and then yeah, so it's really amazing. And then once I saw, which we're going to get into later, your kind of like journal, your new series, the journal series, I was like, oh, I gotta at least give it a shot, because you've got such a depthness of character. One of the things where I want to direct the conversation right now, though, is in that Reels footage, it shows that many of your films, you spend a lot of time trail building. Is that one of the kind of like primary focuses of your content?
It has been for the last 3 years, and that's really because of that athlete that I've been working with. He almost inadvertently made it his brand, because he started a trail during COVID as a way to stay sane, essentially. And it was an outdoor thing you could do. You could, kind of be around people. And he just spent all of his time doing that. And he's like, I'm going to focus on YouTube, and I'm going to focus on doing this trail. And then through that process, we just started to make content that leaned in that direction. And it felt like there was some story to be told there. I feel like in the last couple of years, more trail building stories have been coming out within the mountain bike world. They've always been there, but I think there's been a recognition of like, oh yeah, if we don't build trails, we don't have places to ride our bikes, or if we don't maintain trails, there's not places to ride bikes. And so that has been things that a lot of brands have gotten behind, and they want to tell those stories. It's sort of like the behind the scenes of the mountain bike world, that there's all these unsung heroes. So that's how that kind of came to be. And I think what we've come to a place now is realizing that it's hard to actually maintain. If I'm working with this one athlete locally, primarily, it's hard to maintain that type of work because there's only so many places that you can build trails, let alone them being legal trails that you can actually sanction and have brands support. So I'm in a place now of kind of trying to pivot and figure out like which way is that going to go. But trail building has been a fun thing to document for the last 3 years, I guess.
Absolutely. And so for context, just so because I know my listeners are kind of in our broad spectrum outdoors athletes, if you will. The style of trail that we're kind of referring to here, I would call it quote unquote North Shore riding, where in dense forest, kind of it's a combination of a flow trail, so with elevated berms as well as wood structures. It's all in all a really it. I haven't done any trail building, but I would imagine that is one of the most time intensive and work intensive styles of trails.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, I mean, I think North Shore style is sort of like what it embodies. You might call it free riding. Flow trail is a lot of these things that we're building are kind of flow trails. I just call it mountain biking because it's just, there's so many, like locally where I live, we live outside of a huge mountain bike network, and there's all sorts of different flavors of trails, some that are bumpier and rocky and kind of scary to ride, some of them, and then others are more like a roller coaster that as long as you're willing to let go of your brakes, you're just going to cruise down that thing and have a great time. Um, the ones that are really built up with berms and jumps and things like that are extremely time intensive because most of these places you can't get machinery in there. So it's all hand built, and moving that much dirt around just takes a lot of people and a lot of time. But that's what makes it really pop on the camera, is when you put that extra effort in and make everything really smooth and well shaped so that you can find angles with the camera that really exemplify kind of the art of it. And that's what I've tried to tell with my stories, is like the writing itself is art in a lot of cases, but the building is another way that people creatively express themselves within the sport. And sometimes there's a fusion of that where you're a writer and a builder, and you can really, before you've built it, you almost see what you want in the forest, and you can visualize, oh, there's a jump there and there's a big banked turn here and all that sort of stuff. And I find that that's like what has inspired some of the films, is like the paintbrush for the builder is like the soil and the shovel, like it might be for an artist on canvas.
Yeah, that's a really good description, and it is very clear that you and your team and the people you work with very much see it as their canvas. How much, when you approach a project, I guess I'm pulling from my own, dipping my toe in the water at I've got a fun indoor skydiving channel,
Yeah.
and one of the things that I'm conscious of, and I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but when I jump in the tunnel, I will admit that in the back of my head there is a feeling of I might be on like a 2 minute warm up, and there's this thought that says, "Oh, I gotta mix it up with variety because that's
Uh,
more interesting for the camera." Now,
uh,
do you find that that's true when you're discussing that you want to build a specific trail? Are you thinking of both elements that would show good on screen and work with the terrain, or are you able to separate those two?
um, I think you have to work with the terrain first for sure. And generally I'm leaning on the athlete and the trail builder. Like I've helped build trails, but I would not consider myself an expert trail builder to be able to read landscapes and understand like how doing certain things will add more work to your life if you choose to go against what nature has essentially provided. Um, but the athlete I work with he's been in the content sort of space for quite a long time. And so he understands that. And that's a big focus of the way he builds. The reason he's doing it by hand is because it does less damage to the environment. And you can keep all the beautiful ferns and the moss and all that sort of stuff. And in some cases, we will transplant things out of the areas that are being disturbed for the trail to be able to fill them into areas that are on the edges and things like that, to kind of renaturalize it as much as possible, because that will happen over time. But generally, as soon as that trail's done being built, we want to be there filming it. And so we want it to look that magical feeling to be there, right? Of, maybe the ferns are cresting over the berm so that when he ripping around on his bike, he might brush that fern or something like that, which you wouldn't get if you didn't place some of those things. So there's always at the end of the project kind of going through and doing the landscaping essentially to
Sure.
make it feel like it's been there for a really long time.
And then kind of like after these projects get done and you're able to walk away and Mark walks away, how much maintenance is required to upkeep these trails for the community?
It really depends. If you're a good trail builder, you've thought about like kind of sustainable methods of like drainage and things like that will help keep those trails kind of in better condition. It's so wet where we're at here in BC. So it's got to be able to hold up against that. But some of the trails will be in a sanction network where you've got a crew of people that are going out, volunteers. There's a couple paid staff, but every weekend they're doing maintenance days, keeping this massive network running, because it does take time. And then there's other areas that are less structured, and that just requires people to stop essentially and be like, oh, this berm is messed up. Like, nobody's going to fix it other than me, or, anybody can stop and do this. But if nobody does it, it's just going to keep getting further and further degraded. And I think that's the part that I didn't even have a connection with, having mountain biked prior. They're really understanding that like all these trails don't just exist. Like, somebody has to build them and somebody has to keep them in good condition if we want the sport to continue to thrive essentially. So it can be a lot of work to keep them happy.
Absolutely. And so, for reference, I guess I'm born and raised in Southern California. And so on the probably opposite end of the spectrum with rain. And I find that the mountain biking trails, and don't get me wrong, I got to give the community credit. They have dramatically improved. But when I was growing up, I don't think the same attention to rain was that rain wasn't really, given much thought. And so as a result, when we would get our occasional rain, it would really wreck the trails, as, deep ruts, kind of like cutting through the trails and all of that stuff. So it's good to hear kind of how much you're thinking about it. And I guess I would imagine, though, in your environment, you're kind of forced to think about the
or you're going to do a ton of work, right? You'll have to go back out there and just like do a ton of work. And you will probably have to anyways to a certain degree. But I think everybody now is in that mindset of trying to build trails that will hold up, and recognizing that there's just so many different people in the forest for different reasons. And so if you can do things in the most respectful way possible from like a sustainability point of view, I think it just keeps more stakeholders happy. And, we're all trying to share that space in a way that feels good. So.
Absolutely. And speaking of a lot of work, I find in addition to the trail building, I would say let's talk a little bit through some of the setup that's required. I saw the one video, or the series of videos, where you kind of went over a DIY cable cam.
Wow.
And it seems like to get these shots, you are putting in an enormous amount of effort.
Yeah, the cable cam is a real love-hate relationship. I don't even know how I really first got onto doing that. I think I had seen a couple other filmers that I have looked up to, you getting these really long shots, and I was just like, how is this being done? And this is before FPV drones were really everywhere. So maybe now it feels like a little bit less of a special shot in a way, but the idea with cable cam is to just get a long continuous shot so you can stay with that rider for an extended period of time. And so you've got your line that you've strung between two trees, and you use a come along to just crank it really tight so that it's a really snug line, and then you have a little cart that your camera is hanging off of, and we hook it up with a remote control and a wireless video feed so we can see what the camera sees and we can steer where the camera is looking. And it allows us to get even longer shots, essentially, because if you can imagine a camera pointed in one direction, you have to be pretty dialed in to have that stick with the rider the entire duration. But once you've got a little remote on there, you can do a lot of interesting movement with that. But sometimes we'll put in, I think for one shot, we put a day and a half in for 10 seconds of footage. And it's because our cable cam is this homemade kind of piece of junk, but it does get the shots. And if you've got the money to spend, you can shell out $25,000 to buy a motorized cable camera that is highly repeatable in terms of the way it moves. But we rely on gravity to run our cable cam, so it's all about balancing the speed of the rider, the speed of the cart, and releasing it at the exact right moment so that it kind of keeps pace with the athlete.
Well, that's an incredible amount of time to spend on a 10-second shot. I mean, they certainly they come out amazing quality, so the work definitely shows.
Yeah, it's worth it.
It's worth it. Now, I'm glad that you brought it up. I was going to ask that question, but I was afraid, that I would come off as too beginner like in this conversation. But is it the area where you're stringing cables? It does seem to me too tight to get a drone through.
I think it'd be tough. I think you can do it. I'm not a big fan of FPV drones personally. I don't love the behind the rider angle that they tend to lean towards. I think some of the nicer, bigger FPV drones that you'd see used in larger films, they're two operators essentially. You've got one person flying the drone, and then you have a gimbal mounted on that could be looking uphill or left or right or whatever. So you can have one person focused on not hitting a tree, and the other person can be focused on pointing the camera. And the benefit of the cable is we kind of eliminate the operator a little bit of the drone component by putting a line up. And we know we can run that camera down there a number of times, making sure we have clearance from the trees and stuff like that, because sometimes it's really tight and maybe we'll have to break down some dead branches that are hanging too low or something like that. But when you have to do this shot, sometimes 30 times because either I messed up or maybe the rider's not happy with the way that they looked in that shot, or the lighting was not good, or whatever it might be. Having that repeatability of knowing, like, every time we drop this, it's going in the exact same spot at the exact same speed. And then it just comes down to me steering the thing properly and the rider doing their thing in a way that they're happy. So some benefits over FPV.
It sounds like it, and it sounds like too. It from watching some of that footage. It's I'm assuming much easier with a cable cam to get ahead of the rider or to manipulate maybe that distance in front, beside, kind of all those different perspectives, if you will.
Yeah, to a degree, we kind of say, do we want the shot to lead the rider? Do we want to be a perfect profile of the rider, or whatever it might be? And we'll probably try a few different versions of that until we are like, this one shows the rider's style and abilities the best, because there are certain angles that'll really lend to seeing a specific thing that the rider is doing. Like if they're whipping their tail to the left in the back of behind them and you're in front of them, you might not be able to see that as well than if you were to the side of them or something like that. It kind of would depend on the specific trick that they're doing.
And I think this it shows how much work you're putting into the cable cam. And then I'm starting to think through all your shots, and it seems like a lot of effort goes into a wide range of shots. Another one of my favorites, now I would call it kind of the discovery trail, where there's a path laid out in front of you that sort of disappears as the rider runs through. But I'm sure you can describe it much better than I can.
Yeah, so that you're talking about is Blueprint, and we made that film for Shimano, and the idea was to tell that sort of artistic vision of the trail builder. And the way there's a lot of iterations, I guess, of how we saw that. What we landed on, I'm overall happy with. It isn't like the exact thing that I saw in my mind, but time and budget and skill is part of the equation. But It was kind of like imagining a painter painting a picture before your eyes was what we wanted to show with that. And um, when we went into that project, Mark always does these things he calls build lapses. So he'll set up his GoPro, set up a time lapse, and he'll build a section of trail. And you just see him working away. It's like 4 hours condensed into 10 seconds. And so it was like, how can we fuse that with a rider being in the shot and kind of make it a little bit more just visually unique by just seeing the trail magically appearing. And there have been other films. Years ago, there's a film called Life Cycles that is like a very famous mountain bike film that is one that's referred to in many cases. And they did a shot where it went from spring or I think it went from fall to winter to spring or something like that on the same section of trail as the rider is coming through. And it's beautifully done. And it's done in a much simpler way than what we did, because at the time it's a much older film and they were just doing things differently. But it was where we drew a lot of the inspiration from for how we wanted our effect to look for that.
That's really cool. And I really like the behind the scenes where it would show you kind of the trail was already built and then you would prep it by covering it back up before, almost like I guess I would have referred to it as like a stop motion strategy to get the whole thing.
Well, we ended up just doing it in two stages. We had the testing for this project was there was numerous levels of testing and different like processes of figuring out what was this effect going to look like. And so we tried doing full stop motion where we were digging the trail 6 inches at a time, which before this project, I didn't fully understand what trail building meant. After doing the project, I'm like, oh, this is ridiculous. There's no way you can make a trail that has flow without building it and kind of moving that earth around a little bit. So that didn't work. And then we shifted things to more like a before and an after, essentially. So we had the finished trail, like you said, and then we would cover it again, and then we would film both versions of that, and then we would put them together in post, basically, and gradually reveal that trail in post. And there were a few iterations in between that, but that one was the one that just felt like the most achievable, because we needed lighting conditions to be relatively similar between the two shots so that they could blend seamlessly on the computer and the rider isn't really underexposed in one or whatever that might be. But it was still a pretty tedious process afterwards to blend those shots together and make it seem somewhat believable.
Sure. It came out amazing. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned that you waited for kind of lighting conditions, or that you needed similar lighting conditions. But I also saw, kind of in addition to everything else that you're doing, there were a couple behind the scenes. This one was the when you were highlighting the custom made bike, and you brought in lighting as well as a fog machine to just kind of like dial in the right environment. Is that, are you bringing in external lights on every set, or was that a special case?
That was a special case for that one. Generally, we're trying to find overcast days to shoot on. We just like that giant softbox of a cloudy day, and fortunately in BC we get a lot of that. And it just gives us nice uniform light on those days. So we don't have really harsh shadows or that really dappled forest that's hard to get a good exposure in. But that particular shoot that you're referring to, we wanted to really show off the bike in this sort of moody, I don't know, almost like a horror film or something. Like, it was supposed to kind of feel like the bike is painted with sharks attacking, essentially. That was Mark's nickname is Mark the Shark, and so that's where this bike name and bike idea came from. And so the beginning of that film, we really wanted this intensity, and the whole time we were like, oh, how do we get these dark, moody vibes? And I had been wanting to pick up a fog machine for a long time, and it was a good reason to do it. And the photographer was keen to invest in it with me, and we were just like, let's just do this and have a good time. And had to find that right location in the forest. We scouted around for a while and ended up using the cable cam setup to a certain degree, except instead of hanging a camera, we were hanging just a light over top of things. And yeah, we just kind of had a vision of, like, took a bunch of concept shots that we had found, built a little bit of a mood board for that, and figured out how to make that happen in our context.
Man, awesome.
But
Now,
not usually lighting stuff. That's would be too much work.
okay, that's an over the top, a special case
Yeah,
kind of day.
yeah.
Now, as you think to your future projects, are you hoping to stay kind of in the sector of mountain biking that you exist now, or expand out to cycling and mountain biking covers such a wide range of sports, and really like there's like sports within sports. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I am in a space where I'm ready to branch out a little bit more, and I think part of that is that I've been working with the same athlete quite a bit, and I feel like I've told a lot of his story, and so most of what we do together now feels more like it leans towards showing off his riding abilities, which I still plan to continue to do. But what's always gotten me excited about filmmaking is the storytelling aspect of things. And so I think there will be a bit of a shift towards new stories that I want to tell, and that might be within action sports, but it might be about an artist, or it might be about, I don't know, somebody that's just passionate about some particular hobby or something like that, and moving more into the documentary space and just trying to tell or make films that are creating impact in the world. And when I was farming, I was growing organic vegetables, and it always felt like, oh, it's really clear that my work is doing good, but it's doing good in this really small microcosm. And getting into filmmaking, I was like, oh, I could make this larger impact because these films would be seen by thousands of people instead of the 200, 300 families that I'm feeding. Um, and so I kind of lost touch with that a little bit, I think, just in the process of trying to make a business that could pay for my life to exist. So now that I feel like I've stabilized that piece, it's the ability to start coming back to some of those core values of why I want to do this work, and start telling some of those stories, whether it's environmental stuff, or what's really is getting me more excited now is stuff on the social end, and like why or how can the people that are on the planet now live a good life, and how can we encourage more people to live a good life? And that could be all sorts of stories that fulfill that kind of vision. But I'm kind of on the lookout now of how do I get to that. And I think I'm not a producer, and I'm a director to a degree, but I really feel like my role is I'm a cinematographer. And so I think part of what I'm hoping to do is connect with people that are in that next sort of level of working with a larger team, where it's not just me and a photographer and a mountain biker. It's I'm part of a crew of 5 to 10 people, and there's somebody whose specialty is finding those stories. And then, I can help tell that story and really share that, but finding it isn't always my strongest skill set.
Sure, sure. Well, I think that's a really good segue into what I would call your new YouTube journal series.
Yeah.
Where is that a good way to describe it? And what are you trying to do with this
Yeah.
kind of new? Yeah.
I think it's a good way to describe it. It may evolve as time goes on into what it actually is, but part of where that came from is going back to, again, keeping that content flowing on YouTube and trying to come up with types of content that I can make that feel like genuine to who I am, and are also not a ton of work from a lesson planning point of view, or just from a lot of B-roll point of view, potentially. Like, I do like
Hmm.
to do behind the scenes, and I like to do stuff about specific pieces of gear, but sometimes making those videos is a real push for me. I'm just like, oh, I got to film all these shots. And I feel like there's this space in social media right now where authenticity and just like sharing your experience has become valued in a way that it maybe wasn't over the last 5 years or something like that, where it was a bit more of a curated representation of a person. And that's where this journal came out of. It's like, it's something I can do without a whole lot of planning, because I'm always thinking about these things, right? Now I just need to be able to verbalize it. And it also gives me an opportunity to try to come up with an interesting frame from a cinematography point of view that is maybe non-traditional. And that's the first one I sort of talk off camera intentionally. I just like wanted to do something that was different, and whether or not that turns people off or makes them stick around because they're like, this is different, we'll see. But I think the hope is that every one of those videos I'll be coming up with maybe it won't always be one, maybe sometimes it'll be a few different frames, but try to think of it as like, oh, this could be like a cool frame in a documentary that's just not that standard talking to camera, I think, that we've just seen too much of. And so it gives me an opportunity to, I'm a bit of a verbal processor. And so it gives me an opportunity to process some of the things I'm thinking about in a way that I hope helps people that are me 3 years ago, 5 years ago, that are looking to hear from people that are in the industry, talking authentically about that experience and not just talking about gear or a tutorial or whatever it might be, because there's a lot more to that, running that business aside from just operating a camera.
Well, now what I like about your first episode or your first installment, if you will, is that I think it really comes forward and it almost is like an expose of lifting up the hood of what it's been like for you. When you look at your films and your behind the scenes stuff, it's so clear that you're putting in, such a large, not only amount of like physical work, but just you seem to be really investing very heavily in these films. And they do, to your point, I think the result is an amazing but really curated project where it's almost like a little bit, it stands alone, and it stands away from the audience versus seeing you, as you say, kind of verbally process both the amazing like positives, but also some of the negatives of
Mhm.
what you do. I think really brings the audience in.
Mhm.
One of the first things that you hit on is describing the difference between, and you've talked about it a little bit, right, between farming and then kind of going to filmmaking. And I think you use the term straightforward versus too big picture in terms of trying to make a completable task list. Do
Wow.
you find that it's often you're walking away from days of filming feeling like, I almost want to say like you have, not that you haven't accomplished anything, but it's harder to point to a tangible result?
To a degree, yeah. It's like you don't feel that final result almost till the film is done. And some of these projects are months in the making. Like right now, I'm in the process of editing a film about mountain biking in Iceland, and I shot it in August, and I edited it, and it's in the client's hands to kind of provide feedback and stuff like that. And then there'll be the final stages of wrapping that up, and then it'll at some point get released, and hopefully people will like it. But it's like almost a year between starting that and finishing that before I really know, like, did I complete something that I'm proud of? Um, and with farming, it was like every day you could see little clear completable tasks. And I've tried to find ways to do that with filming, and it's to a certain degree possible to break those things down. Like I kind of love at the end of the month doing my bookkeeping because it's like so easy to be like, I entered my receipts, I've checked all my invoices, and it's like, check, that is done. So finding those sorts of things is really where it's at for me. And I think a lot of it is in the concept development, though, that I find it's really hard to know, like, is this a cool idea? And getting that to a place where you're getting funding for that, it's just like all these sort of random steps, and part of that may be due to inexperience in the industry still, and maybe once you're in it for 20 years, it's like, oh, here's the process, and each of those things has a set of to-do items, and once you do that, you know you did a good job.
In terms of the to-do items, and I'm very, that resonates me just because I'm coming from a, as we kind of talked about beforehand, coming to a corporate, from a corporate world that was very task oriented, results oriented, and so you would walk away at the end of the day with saying, hey, I've completed XYZ. Now, in the case of what you're doing, I'm thinking back to your cable cam example. Do you not walk away at the end of the day and say, "Hey, I got 10 shots and one of them is good," or is that doesn't quite click in the same way that maybe farming does?
It does sometimes, for sure. Like with the cable cam shots, it definitely does, because it's like we're really clear when we've got it. We're like, we're stoked, and sometimes you'll see that in the behind the scenes. You'll just see how like happy the athlete is. Usually that's when I'm most happy, is like when he's happy,
Mm.
because he's really particular about how he wants his ability on his bike to be shown. And I've learned kind of how to work with him to do that. Um, and so that feels good. But then when it's a bigger piece that's maybe more of a documentary focused piece, and you maybe don't even have the full story, you know, you have a structure that the story lives within, and then you kind of got to go home and start carving that out of the hours of interview footage. And it's like, did that person say anything good that I can turn into a story? So I think that's where it becomes a little bit more murky, is some of these bigger jobs that it's not just about a good shot. When you get a good shot, that always feels great. But it's like the story is what I find is really what carries a lot of films when it's not just focused on the action of mountain biking. And that's when it's a bit vague.
Now, to that point, how often do you get an amazing shot and then bring it back to the editing room and just realize it doesn't fit with the story, and you're going to have to throw it out, or
And
you know, does that happen?
not that often for me,
Okay.
because we're always the budgets always feels too small. I kind of I always wish they were bigger. And um, I am always putting in more time than what I'm really probably, you know, if I was compensating myself appropriately, because I want the work to be something that I'm proud of at the end of the day. And so usually we're working a spot until we're like, we have the shot, and I'm kind of visualizing the edit a little bit in my mind. Like there's going to be things that move around, but with the project we were doing, the cable cam, actually, we shot that over 9 days for a minute and 20 seconds, minute and 40 seconds, as 100 seconds, whatever it was. So they call these videos raw 100s, and they're basically just bike sounds, 100 seconds of footage, and that's the video. And every day we would shoot something, I would go home and I would kind of start plugging it into the edit. So partially because I was just so stoked to see these cable cam shots on the big screen, but partially to see like where the gaps were. And it's like, okay, we've got this cool cable cam. He's riding in this direction. Now I need a shot of him turning in this direction, because we wanted the whole thing to feel like one trail, even though it's shot on about 6 different trails. We wanted it to feel connected. And so getting those detailed shots that are like a close up of the tire or something, or the athlete ripping by the camera or something like that. That's how I sometimes can make sure that I don't waste a bunch of time on a shot that I don't need. Like I didn't want to shoot any more cable camera shots than I had to for that particular project, because each one was like a minimum of 4 hours of work.
Now, excuse me. Now, oh, excuse me. Now, how delayed is the audience feedback? I'm just thinking in terms of the timeline from raw footage to ultimate production to kind of showing, and then it seems like there might be a potential pretty long runway in terms of audience feedback, and also how important is that to pulse that out?
Yeah, it is. It is a bit of a long timeline. Sometimes Mark and I are both always like, we just want to get it out as soon as we finish it. But you know, you have to move through that process of making sure that the brand is happy with what you've made. If they have any feedback. Bigger projects that are longer format just take longer too, just for people to work through. When it's a short little 2-minute edit, that's pretty simple. People can watch it, say that looks cool. You know, what's your release schedule? They may have other projects that they have coming out as well, the brands. So sometimes it has to fit within their structure. But sometimes, you know, it's usually minimum of a month from filming to delivery of people actually being able to see it. And then getting positive feedback is, I wouldn't say it's why I do it, but it's definitely keeps the stoke going. And like getting a staff pick on Vimeo those are some career highlights for me. Like I've always watched staff picks to get inspired, and to see some of my films mixed in there is what makes me be like, oh, okay, like I do kind of know what I'm doing a little bit, and I can make stuff that's interesting. And so it kind of just validates you enough to push to the next level. And that's kind of how I see it, is like every project is, I want to be learning something new so that I can push that next project a little bigger budget or a little bigger crew or a location that's further away. That 5 years ago, like thinking about going to Iceland to film a project 5 years ago with a bit of budget sounds terrifying. I would not have known where to start. And so all these pieces have been incremental steps to getting closer to that.
It's really cool to I guess watch your growth and hear about your growth in that kind of avenue, or if you will. Now, I think that pairs well with another topic that you brought up in your journal series. You kind of touched on this feast or famine lifestyle.
Well,
Yeah, walk us through that, and how do you try to smooth things over?
yeah, it's a tough one. It's different than getting like having a 9 to 5 job where you're just getting that paycheck, whether it's salary or wage, but you show up and you're getting paid. Whereas with this, it's so project based. And as the budgets have gotten bigger, it generally means less projects per year. And so you get large sums of money that you are having to portion out for yourself as well as other creatives that might be on that project with you. So I think it's that trying to keep the work flowing in while you're concurrently trying to finish projects is the part that can be challenging sometimes, because you're trying to be creative in the really focused way on a job that you're editing maybe, but your mind has to kind of be working in the background of like, what's the next thing? So you don't go into those times when there's not a lot of money flowing in. And I think it's just being comfortable. Like I live very simply for the most part. The most expensive things I own are basically my work things. And otherwise I live a pretty simple life, and just being comfortable with, easing into that when it's appropriate. And then, when the money is there, you can maybe buy a new camera lens, but I pretty much dump everything back into the business right now. It's in that place where it's stable, but I want to grow either my own production company that has people more than just me working within it, or be saying, you know, what I have is my baseline and I'm getting hired by like a crew essentially. And then I maybe stop investing so much into the business and just kind of keep it at a stable place.
Sure, sure. I mean, that just seems like a bit of a challenging situation. But I liked your comment that as you grow, I mean, I guess the theory is that kind of smooths itself out over time.
Sure.
You touched on a topic that I thought was really interesting, and I've experienced. This is episode. Depending on how I get them out, I believe we're going to be around episode 12, and I'm already finding, like you said, there is a tension between, if you will, preparing for the single episode that I'm on, but in the back of my head too, I'm realizing that in order to have a successful podcast, you just have to stack up, kind of, if you will, clients or people on the background, and so there's always that tension. And as you touched on, a real value into having some of those soft skills, or at least non-creative skills, in terms of project management and pushing beyond that. How important is networking, cold pitching, communication in your realm?
I think I'm learning more and more that it's super important. In
Sure.
the early days, I probably did more of it. And then when I was linked up with this athlete, he had so much of that work done already. He had done that work himself and gotten sponsors that are basically giving him money to come up with ideas to utilize that. So I was a bit complacent. And now what I'm kind of realizing is I'm coming out of this space of being quite busy and wanting to pivot a little bit and start doing more story-driven work that maybe isn't mountain biking. It's like, oh yeah, those are things you need to be stewarding all the time, and staying connected with your peers potentially that you've worked alongside, but also the people that are the step above you in terms of the scale of projects they're working on. So they might think of you, because I think people generally like to work with their friends or people that they've at least have some rapport with, right? Like hiring a random person that you've never even met, even if their work looks great, is a bit of a wild card when you're bringing them into, especially an adventure focused shoot where you might be like sleeping in tents, all crammed into a tiny car for 2 weeks or something like that. You want to make sure that you like them. So yeah, I think growing that is really, really critical.
I think what you've touched on is really true across the board, whether it's a startup or even a career job or anything like that. It's so important to like the people that you work with, and I would even take somebody that is of perhaps a slightly lesser skill set, just given the hours that you have to spend, across the table working with
Hmm.
them. And I think too, the product is probably ultimately better given that it's a much more positive relationship that I think translates into whether it's
Totally.
film. Yeah. we're,
Yeah.
we're on the same page there.
Yeah, fully. Yeah. I mean, I used even when I was in the farming days, I worked in a not for profit for a while, and we were always told it was like a startup sort of not for profit thing. And the mentors were like hire for fit. It's like more important than the skill set. And so I think, yeah, it applies everywhere.
And it's interesting that you kind of almost kind of like lucked out and were able to be complacent on those skill sets.
Yeah.
So now are you finding that you're investing a lot of time and energy in terms of into just networking more and getting that fire going?
Yeah, I've really been using this sort of slow time. It's always slow this time of year for the type of work that I'm doing. Maybe if you're a ski filmer, you're busy right now, but for mountain bike stuff, it's slow. And I think people hold budgets at this time of year until they're sort of like, what are we doing this season? So I always use this time to like reflect on business, be like, where am I going? What are some goals and that sort of stuff? And then, yeah, build some of those relationships back up that either maybe slid because we were all busy, or maybe they're new relationships. And I've just been trying to reach out to everybody on the island. Our island is quite large. It's 300,000 people, which is maybe not huge, but it's a relatively decent amount of people to reach out to. And so I've just been trying to get to those people and to say, hey, I exist. I'd love to grab a coffee with you. Love to have a Zoom conversation. And I've had some other folks reaching out to me that have found me on YouTube, and really just putting that effort into networking with people, because you never know where those relationships can go, and you might glean a little bit of knowledge from that person while you're having coffee, or be able to share some knowledge for them. And I think that's what it's all about. It's just kind of just trying to bring everybody up. Like, I don't like to see the other people that I work around as competitors. I really would rather look at them as collaborators. And maybe we don't have a project right now that we can collaborate on, but everybody needs video work. So to promote their business. So I don't think there's a shortage. It's just figuring out the right way to pitch that to a company so that they see that value and they're like, oh yeah, I want to work with you on this. So
That's that's really cool to hear, and just like a positive vibe all around. I like that. And
Sure.
now you touched on maybe the seasonality of your work. Does it pick up in the spring summer months and then kind of dip back down?
yeah, sort of. And I think our prime times for filming is spring and fall because of the overcast weather. In the summer, you can get away with it in some cases, but filming in the forest in the summer is really challenging. With that dappled light, it's like really specific what you can film and how you can film it. Whereas at this time of year, if it's not raining, it's just kind of the same light all day long. And so you can just be guaranteed that while the sun is up, you've got a perfect outdoor studio to be shooting in. So we consolidate most of the bigger bike stuff into the spring and fall.
And then on in kind of the journal episode, you mentioned that you really like, and I actually like this myself, that the kind of the new route that I'm doing and what you're doing now as opposed to farming really allows, I think you referenced freedom of the job, not being tied to one place. Does that extend? I mean, are you hoping to film kind of outside the walls? I know you mentioned a project, some projects that are perhaps outside of the country.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's both freedom in where you can go with the work, but it's also just freedom to not have to work. Like, I'm a big advocate of like, I don't really need to make a bunch of money. I need to survive and be able to do the things I want to do. And but like living life is really a high priority for me. And I found with farming, I was just always so tied to that place because there's a million baby plants that I'm trying to keep alive, and need to sell them on a weekly basis. And with this, if there's a week where I'm just like not feeling creative, and I can just not work if I don't want to. I mean, that's partially an advantage of working for yourself and being able to live somewhat frugally, but I can just decide, oh, I'm going to go camping this week, or I'm going to go on a road trip, and that sort of thing, I think adds a lot of value to my life, in a way that money can't. And, that's a piece that I do struggle with as I think about, oh, growing a team, or, um, joining on with the production company, right? It becomes a 9 to 5 again. And that was part of what I was trying to get away from when I left farming. And I don't know that I could go back to it fully. I mean, I'm always open to trying, but you get kind of spoiled in deciding when you need to wake up and go to bed and all that sort of stuff when you work for yourself.
Sure, sure. That freedom and flexibility is definitely appealing. It's interesting though. It sounds like you've got quite a few different tensions between that freedom and then like also maybe wanting to work with a team and collaborate more with an external group. So I'm really excited to see how it all comes together and how you pull it through. So I guess coming up in the next few weeks or months, should we expect more from the journal series? Other works? What's upcoming?
Well, I think right now it's starting to move into like slightly busier, which is nice. We're coming out of that famine phase into the hopefully a feast phase. But um, I am working with a couple local filmmakers, and we're just talking about doing some stuff for fun together. We've done a little bit of work together on paid stuff, but it's been super minimal. And so it's trying to grow those relationships in a super low pressure way where we can be creatively free to make what we want. And so that'll be coming up, and hopefully some behind the scenes stuff that'll be linked up with those projects as well. But yeah, more of the journal series. I've been doing these photo walk series as well, which is again another kind of like low um, amount of pre-thinking I need to do to make content that people are finding value in. And it's like, I want more of that in my life. Like being able to make content that just like fits with how I want to be in the world is really nice. So hope to do more of that. And then a couple bigger mountain bike projects this year, even though I'm sort of gradually making that transition, recognizing that you still have to feed yourself. And I think we're going to try to pitch a bit of a bigger project for another one of these raw 100 style videos where it's just bike sounds and beautiful shots, but potentially collaborating with another filmmaker on that. So looking forward to that. Hopefully the budgets will all come through, and we can dive into that. But otherwise, Iceland will be coming out before long. I'm pretty happy with how that project came together. It's a longer format piece. It's about a 20-minute doc about everything going on with mountain biking in that country. And so things are coming down the pipes. And I think it's just now figuring out like what does this next year look like, and how do I kind of steer the ship so it's going in that direction that is the vision for 2024, essentially, because it is a slow process of building those relationships and finding those stories that are going to be good to tell.
Sure, sure. Planning out far ahead. Well,
Yeah.
Scott, I wanted to thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been great and super informative to hear your perspective on, your growth, and then as to what you're interested in. You have a ton of insight into this world. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was a good time.